In the last section, we added our find query, and we were able to confirm with the console log that this found a list of all of our users in our database with the name of Joe. So here's a name of Joe right here. So now the question becomes, how are we going to write an assertion around this? How are we going to make sure that that first user in here is the Joe that we created up here? You might think, well, maybe we could just assert that they both have a name of Joe. Well, that would definitely work, but kind of the goal here is to make sure that we are finding this very particular user that we just inserted to our database. This would be a great use case of using the ID property that every Mongo record gets assigned. So if we flip back over to our terminal, you'll see that it has the _ID property. One thing to be really clear about with Mongoose and MongoDB is that even when we first create a user, like when we said new user right here and we assigned it to Joe, it was automatically assigned an ID by Mongoose. This works in kind of contrast to a lot of other ORMs and ODMs where an ID will not be assigned to it until it's actually saved to the database. So even though Joe right here has not yet been saved, it still has an _ID property. And that _ID is exactly equal to the ID that it will be saved with once it's actually inserted into the database. So Mongoose is really making a big assumption here. Mongoose is assuming that it can generate a unique enough ID before it actually gets saved to the database. So let's use that ID to write our assertion inside of our then block down here. So we are going to want to make sure that the first user in this user's array has an identical ID to Joe's ID. So let's give this a shot. So I'm going to write in an assert statement, and we'll say users at 0, so the first user in that array. Let's look at their ID property, and I expect that to be absolutely equal to Joe's ID. All right. So let's save this, and let's run our specs. Let's see what happens. So let's say npm run test. And well, this definitely doesn't look good at all. Looks like our test actually failed. So reading users out of the database, test failed, the one we just wrote. And says specifically here, assertion error, false, true. So for some reason, it looks like our comparison here failed. Well, let's go ahead and console log out both these IDs and just take a look at them, make sure that it's actually, what I just claimed about the Joe getting an ID created when we first create the record right here. Let's make sure that's actually the case. So I'll console log out the first user's ID, and I'll console log out Joe's ID as well. So I'll save, rerun my tests. And okay, there's the console log. Let me scroll back up to it. And if I compare both these IDs, well, that's interesting. They definitely look identical to me. So what's going on here? Well, this is definitely one of the biggest gotchas of everything around Mongoose and Mongo. If you recall, a while ago, when we were looking inside of RoboMongo, so I still have my users collection open here, I'm going to expand the singular record, and when we looked at the _ID property, we had seen that it had a value of not just the string of the ID, but specifically object ID and the string right here. So when we look at the _ID property of a Mongo or Mongoose record, we are not looking at a raw string of the ID, even though that's what it looks like when we console log it up here, even though that's what it looks like. In fact, what we are looking at is an object of object ID, which somehow encapsulates that string. It somehow wraps that string inside of it. And so even though these two records right here have identical IDs, the object ID that wraps them will fail an == comparison test, like we have right here. So the big takeaway here is that the _ID property is a little bit misleading. It doesn't quite behave the way you would expect when it comes to comparison. To get a reference to the actual string ID, to like the raw string of the ID, we have to call _ID dot toString on both sides. So on both the users at 0 and Joe, I'll reference _ID and then call toString. This takes the object ID object and it pulls out the actual string that's sitting inside of there. And so we can compare the two strings, which I would definitely expect to be equal. So I'm going to clear out the console log statements. Let's save that. And then let's run our tests again. So let's say npm run test. And okay, definitely behaves much better now. So again, this is something that will definitely bite you in the rear once you start trying to compare IDs of any type. Because the underscore ID is actually an object ID and not a just raw string, as you might expect with many other databases out there and ORMs out there, we have to call the toString function whenever we want to make some kind of comparison between this ID and another one. Okay, so definitely wraps up a little bit of a gotcha here with Mongo. One other thing that I want to mention before we move on to our next test, where we will try out the find1 function, is that it's definitely getting a little bit tedious to have to keep typing npm run test again and again and again and again every single time we want to run our tests. So maybe we should also spend a little bit of time in the next section to see if we can't come up with a little bit of a command to automate our test running. So let's take care of both our find1 query, our find1 test, and see if we can't enhance our test suite a little bit more in the next section.